My brief today has been to talk to you about different ways that women can be empowered through dairying, and what are the lessons that we can learn from other areas that have been successful in empowering women, and how can we bring those lessons into Southeast Asia to help our own dairy industry. This is not a typical Southeast Asian dairy farm, and some of the differences that you'll be aware of are that these animals forage for themselves on high quality fodder. They are free to roam and move around their dairy farm, and they walk back to the milking parlour, to be milked twice each day. At least twice each day. But Southeast Asia is not a typical or a traditional dairy production region. What are some of the differences? Well, for dairy producers in Southeast Asia, we are faced with suboptimal environmental conditions which impact on our dairy production. So we have temperature and humidity issues which are quite detrimental in many cases to dairy production. We have fodder species to deal with which are of lower quality nutritionally than those fodder species which are generally used in traditional dairying countries. And in particular, we face the problem of scarcity of land and competition for land use. And this impacts on dairy farming in Southeast Asia because in most cases, dairy fodder is harvested well away from where it is consumed by the cows. This impacts on both the quantity and the quality of the fodder which they are able to eat. So obviously some of these detrimental conditions or suboptimal conditions impact on animal welfare, on reproduction and on productivity. This is much more like the dairy farming conditions which we are more familiar with in Southeast Asia. These cows are totally reliant on managers to provide feed, and the degree of expertise of those managers will determine in large part the productivity that we see. Interestingly though, many traditional dairy farming nations have had large impacts on some areas in Southeast Asia and Asia. And so what we see is a large range of both scale and experience and expertise and technical competency in dairy farms across Southeast Asia. So we see in some cases large dairy farms. This one is more than 1,000 head of cattle. They're in freestall barns. They're eating a total mixed ration, and their cow comfort has been considered through the use of airflow, sprinklers and things like that. But we also see medium-sized dairy farms. Medium scale's probably more like we're used to here in Thailand, but these animals, you might notice, are tied. They may or may not have free access to water, and they may or may not have free access to feed. Mostly though, in Southeast Asia, we are dealing with smallholder dairy farmers. And on smallholder dairy farms, very small scale farming, in general, management is not of a high quality, and in general, returns from these enterprises are quite low. We've also heard this morning from several of our speakers that governments across Southeast Asia are looking to dairy as an integral part of future food security. Local production, the aim is for having local dairy production which will meet local dairy needs. And we've also heard this morning that per capita intake of dairy products across Asia is increasing at a greater rate than milk production is increasing. And why is this so? Well, one of the reasons that per capita increase in dairy consumption is increasing is because our diets in Southeast Asia are becoming more westernised and therefore relying more heavily on dairy ingredients and dairy products. Another reason is because we've got now much more widespread access to refrigeration, and long shelf life products is also enhancing the ability for us in Southeast Asia to increase our milk consumption. Per capita incomes also have a part to play in that. Another reason why per capita consumption is increasing is through government policies. And one example is the Milk for Schools policy, which is being rolled out across many nations in Southeast Asia, many regions. These children becoming familiar with drinking milk several times a week, and when these children grow into adults, they will also require dairy in their diets, and they will require dairy in their own children's diets. So we can see that there's a trend for the future milk consumption or dairy consumption will be growing. This data is showing us that across Asia there is a steady increase in per capita milk consumption. In India, a rapid increase over the last probably 30 years. In China, the increase has become very rapid in the last 10 to 15 years. Southeast Asia has shown a steady increase in per capita milk consumption. Not a huge and rapid increase, but a steady increase. Now I'd like to drill down into smallholder dairy farming, because smallholders constitute more than 90% of the dairy farming enterprises in Southeast Asia. Usually smallholder dairy farms are part of a mixed farming enterprise, and not always is production or productivity from the animals on those farms of primary concern. Livestock, we also need to remember that on these smallholder farms, livestock are actually considered as liquid assets. But what we do know is that the dairy production from these cows contributes greatly to household food self-sufficiency, even though they don't always contribute to household income. We also know that in smallholder dairy farms, women take on a high livestock management role. Women's role is of primary importance. And we also can see that on these smallholder dairy farms, in general, labour has a low degree of technical training. So we have lots of work to do in this space. In terms of dairy farming women, as I said, they generally have a higher role to play in the practical part of dairy farming, in livestock management and farm management, than their male counterparts. But they have in general also a lower, or they're less involved in financial decision making on these smallholder enterprises, apart from making financial decisions within their household. So it's important for us to realise that the control that women have over their dairy farming businesses is quite high in the practical sense, but quite low in terms of financial management and what happens to the income that's generated from those farms. This has an effect on women's attitudes, and they're often living in poverty, they feel powerless, and sometimes they lack motivation to change or to improve their situation because they don't have control of the income that they generate. And because of these things, I believe that the true value of women in the dairy value chain is actually undervalued and reduced. Now, where we see gender equality across the world, we also see economic growth. Where gender inequality exists, we see delayed economic and human development and depressed economies. So I think that we have a responsibility and that we should be aiming to encourage equal engagement of both men and women across all levels of the dairy value chain. And in doing that, we will inject the economy, and the economy of the dairy industry to make it much more lively, if you like. So let's look at some examples now of how women have been empowered in the dairy industry, and where that has happened, we have seen rapid increases in dairy productivity. Once women's roles are recognised on dairy farms and strategies to increase their involvement have been developed, we've seen rapid increases in productivity in the dairy industry. Women can lead industry change in the industry. We need to remember that and develop some strategies to assist that to happen. So I'd like to give you some examples now. In India, Early in the 1990s, the National Dairy Development Board trialled some programs because they recognised the importance of women's roles in dairy farming. Their aim was to increase women's participation on their own farms, but they also had hopes that in doing so, some women would take on greater roles and responsibilities and become active members of dairy cooperatives and board members of unions and cooperatives. So some of the specific strategies that the NDDB implemented were training of women in leadership and negotiation skills, financial management, credit, education and health. They identified leaders in communities who were women, or potential leaders who were women, and provided them with extra skill. And those women went on to become mentors, they became active in dairy co-ops, they took on leadership roles. And they also formed women's thrift groups where women were able to control the income that they generated from their own dairy farms, and they used that income in credits and loan schemes where the income that was earned was available for purchase of livestock requirements or purchase of livestock to enhance their own businesses. These trials by the NDDB were very successful, so by mid-1990s they were rolled out across India, and the outcomes that were seen, more milk across the nation was produced. Women had more control over their income that they generated from their dairy farms, and because they were more in control, they had more self-esteem and more confidence. They became active participants in their own dairy farms and in the management of their farms, and more of them took up leadership and management roles outside of their own farms on dairy co-ops and in milk unions. Some all-women cooperatives were formed, and now in India millions of women are engaged all along the dairy value chain. This was a really successful story. Another example that I would like to run past you is a small project that was done by Oxfam in northern Sri Lanka after the war and after the tsunami had gone through. Many communities were impoverished, and this dairy community was the focus of a project. Dairy women were given training, they were given technical training, financial management training, leadership and negotiation skills, and a women's dairy cooperative was established in that region. The women's dairy cooperative didn't cut across men's income earning capacity in this case. They produced value-added dairy products, and so they weren't seen as competitors to what men were doing already in that community. And the outcomes from this project was that, first of all, household incomes and household assets increased, and the whole community benefited through better nutrition. More milk was produced, more women were engaged in dairy farming, and they produced value-added products, so they increased the range of product that was produced. Women's self-esteem and confidence increased, and they became mentors to other women in the community. They also, due to their increase in self-confidence, they joined committees of management, and importantly, the attitudes of men in the community changed towards women. Businesses and banks looked at women's applications more favourably. They started to look at, rather than the gender of the applicant, they looked at the quality of the business proposal that was being put up. This led to more women taking out business loans, and overall the local economy improved. So another example of how empowerment of women and support, with support, actually improved the dairy industry in that region. Another example I'd like to give you is one that more recently from Pakistan. Milk generated income in Pakistan is one of the greatest income generators for households in villages in Pakistan. But through a variety of reasons, cultural and religious in particular, women are very rarely the recipients of education and extension training in Pakistan. So a ACR group did a project in some villages in Pakistan where they changed from traditional methods of extension and tried some non-traditional approaches. And those non-traditional approaches particularly were aimed at women. So women were given parallel training to men, women and children were given parallel training to men in these villages. And most importantly, the parallel training was given by female extension officers. So this was acceptable to the communities as well as to the farms themselves. The outcomes of this program was that across those villages, improved dairy practices were adopted, widespread, and I think I put that down to the fact that the whole of the family was introduced to improved dairy practices in this example. Milk-derived household incomes increased by approximately $100 a month, which was fairly significant in those communities. So now let's look at the lessons that we might take from those three examples that I gave you. Most importantly, and the key to empowerment of women, is education and training. Education and training increases women's empowerment and through increasing empowerment, milk production was shown to increase, household and community economies were improved. Secondly, in developing programs to empower women, informal as well as formal techniques have been proved to be successful, very successful. So informally, in smallholder dairy communities, local informal women's networks are very strong, and if we use them, they can be very strong support networks for women. We can also use formal means through schools and formal training. Particularly, we can deliver best practice training to girls and young women who later in their lives will become dairy farmers. Thirdly, it's most important if we want to empower women that we need to build their confidence, and we can do that through technical and financial and leadership training. And we've seen in many examples that once their confidence has increased, they're prepared to take on roles in leadership and management. One of the lessons that worked very well was identification in local areas of women who will become leaders, and they also become mentors and role models for other women. One of the things that's also very important and we shouldn't forget is that we don't want to compete with men. We need to try and aim for equal participation, and to get the support of male community leaders in some of these programs that we try to establish is very, very important. Male community leaders who are supportive will bring along the rest of the community. So it's really important that we make sure we remember that as well. Finally, the use of non-traditional communication methods works well with both men and women, but particularly women who have access problems. We can try some non-traditional communication methods, such as these methods were used in the Pakistan example: TV, radio, video, drama, demonstrations, and problem-based learning. And using all of those lessons that we can learn, we can get a really solid foundation to empower women to be more involved in the dairy industry. We can't only think of the good things though. Before we start any programs of empowerment, we need to look at constraints, and we need to identify these so that we can overcome them. And I want to go through some of the constraints that women face, particularly smallholder dairy farming women. The main constraint that they have is time. They have household duties, they have farm responsibilities. To find extra time to be involved in extension programs or training programs is often very difficult for women. Literacy is another constraint. Often women on smallholder farms have much lower literacy levels than their male counterparts, and we need to bear this in mind when we're developing programs to empower them. Partly due to lack of confidence and low literacy levels, women find it much more difficult than their male counterparts to make contact with service providers and training providers. We need to try to make that process easier for women. Distance is a problem, particularly when travel is required to reach training. Time of delivery is a problem for women. Those women who have heavy household duties and farm duties find that morning sessions, which we often run, are actually very difficult to attend. We need to give that some thought. Public transport and the cost associated with public transport, similarly childcare, are other constraints which we need to consider when we're developing programs for women. In some areas, cultural and religious customs need to be considered, and in some areas legal issues need to be considered too, because often women are precluded from management positions if positions on boards are related to access to land or ownership of land or assets. So I hope that that has left you with some thoughts about how we might incorporate some strategies to empower women, because I also hope that you can see that by empowering women and having equal participation of women and men along the dairy value chain, we will boost the dairy economy in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.